My name is Margaret Walker. I'm 72 years old, and tonight I finally understood what my daughter and her husband had been trying to tell me without saying a word. It happened quietly, the kind of cruelty that doesn't need shouting. And I stood there in the doorway of my room, with my hand still on the knob, as everything inside me fell still. The lamp by my bed was dark, its cord dangling uselessly. I tried the wall switch, and nothing happened. Even the little nightlight I kept in the corner, the one that gave me some comfort when the house got too quiet, was dead. I bent down to check the outlet and realized it wasn't just the bulb. The power was cut. I stood up slowly, knees aching, and let my eyes adjust to the dimness spilling in from the hall. Out there, I could hear them. Plates clinking in the kitchen silverware scraping against ceramic. The faint sound of a chair dragging across tile as someone shifted in their seat. I didn't hear my name. No one called to me. No one even glanced toward my door. They all sat together and ate their lives undisturbed, while mine dimmed just a little more. I stayed in the doorway for longer than I should have, trying to decide if I could pretend it didn't hurt. My hand tightened on the frame. I could feel my pulse and my fingers sharp and fast. Emily's voice drifted out, then cheerful and bright, talking to her husband about something their son had done at school. Not a word about me. Not a single glance toward the dark corner of the house where they'd stashed me like an afterthought. I closed the door softly and leaned back against it. The darkness felt heavier now. It pressed against me like a warning, like a whisper, saying, I was no longer welcome here. For a moment, I actually thought I might cry. But nothing came. Not even that. I sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the dead lamp, its shade tilted slightly, as if even it had given up trying to light the room. It wasn't just about the wires or the outlets, it was about the silence, the way they left me to figure it out for myself. The way they'd decided I didn't deserve to belong anymore, but couldn't bring themselves to say it out loud. It was more efficient this way, quieter. They could finish their dinner, tell themselves they hadn't really done anything cruel, and let me take the hint. I stayed in that room for the rest of the night, not moving, barely breathing, afraid to open the door and see their faces. The shadows stretched long across the floor, and I sat there feeling like a stranger in my own family. And when the house fell quiet again after the dishes were put away, and the lights in the kitchen went dark, I asked myself a question I already knew the answer to. Would you stay in a house where even your silence feels too loud? Back when they still loved me, or at least when they acted like they did, life felt a little softer. I raised Emily alone after her father left when she was just a baby. I worked 2 jobs back then, sometimes 3, when bills stacked up higher than I could breathe under, but I never let her see how scared I was. I cleaned houses in the morning and worked nights at the diner, coming home with my feet throbbing and my uniform smelling like grease. Every dollar went into a coffee can on top of the refrigerator until I had enough for a down payment. That little house was my dream, even if it was nothing special to anyone else. I still remember the day we got the keys. Emily was 10, and she danced through the empty living room barefoot, her laughter echoing off the walls like music. She told me it already felt like home. I smiled so hard my face hurt, even though I knew it meant more years of working doubles just to make the mortgage. I painted every wall myself on the weekends, sometimes late into the night. She picked out pale blue for her bedroom, and I remember sitting cross-legged on the floor with her, both of us splattered in paint, feeling proud of what we'd built. That house wasn't just wood and drywall. It was proof that I could hold my little family together, no matter what. When she got older, she used to joke that no man could ever live up to me. But then she met David, and suddenly she was someone else's girl. At her wedding, she cried in my arms and said she'd always need me. I wanted so badly to believe that, They bought their own place on the other side of town, bigger than anything I could have ever afforded. I still visited every Sunday and brought baked goods, even though David never said much to me. When their little boy Tyler was born, Emily called me crying in the middle of the night. She said she didn't know how she'd manage with work and the baby and begged me to move in with them. At first, it felt like coming home again. She even called the guest room my room and told me they couldn't have done it without me. I cooked dinner most nights, washed their laundry, stayed up with Tyler when he had fever so they could sleep. For a while, I actually felt wanted. Those first few years living with them were full of small moments that kept me hopeful. Tyler loved sitting on my lap while I read him bedtime stories. Emily would hug me after a long day and say she didn't know what she'd do without me. David even smiled sometimes, like maybe he appreciated how much easier I made his life. But little by little, something shifted. The hugs stopped coming as often, and Emily's tone started to harden. She began calling me by my name instead of Mom, and rolling her eyes when I forgot something at the store. David's smiles disappeared too, replaced with sighs and pointed glances when I stayed too long in the kitchen. I told myself it was just stress. They had a mortgage to worry about, jobs that wore them down. I thought if I just kept quiet and did more, they'd remember how much they needed me. But more often than not, they barely even noticed me at all. Dinner time became quieter as they talked around me instead of to me. I stopped sitting at the table and started eating after they were done, telling myself it was just easier that way. The house I once built with my own hands felt less like home and more like a favor they regretted offering. There were nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering when exactly I'd become invisible. I thought about the girl who once danced through an empty living room and swore she'd always need me. I thought about the woman who now couldn't even look me in the eye when she told me I was making too much noise washing dishes after 10. I still cooked for them. I still folded their towels and ironed Tyler's school shirts. But they didn't see it anymore. They didn't see me anymore. And the saddest part was, I started believing maybe that was all I was meant to be. A quiet shadow in someone else's house, waiting for scraps of kindness, telling myself it was better than nothing. Back then, I still told myself they loved me. Back then, I still believed it. But now, I know better. Now I know that sometimes love isn't enough to make someone see you. And when that happens, staying only makes you smaller. It didn't happen all at once. The first cuts were so small, I almost didn't feel them, like tiny splinters that only sting later. Emily would sigh when I left a dish to soak overnight, her voice light but sharp as she said it really wasn't that hard to just finish the job. David started calling me Margaret more often than Mom. His tone clipped when I forgot to lock the back door one afternoon. Tyler stopped looking up from his phone when I walked into the room, barely acknowledging me when I asked about his day. At dinner, my words floated into the air and fell flat as they kept talking over me like I hadn't spoken at all. I began to notice how Emily winced when I used too much butter in the mashed potatoes, how she'd take the plate from my hands and scrape it into the trash without meeting my eyes. David would mutter under his breath when I sat too long in the living room and flipped through magazines while he tried to watch his shows. And Tyler stopped saying goodnight altogether, just closed his bedroom door behind him without a sound. Some nights, I sat at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed, listening to the refrigerator hum and feeling like a guest who had overstayed. It was always the little things that hurt most. Like the time Emily asked me if I could stop folding the towels her way because it made them look messy. But nothing cut deeper than the day she stood in front of me and said I didn't really contribute anything. Her words landed quiet but heavy, and I felt my chest tighten as she kept talking about bills and stress and how they were already doing so much for me. She didn't even notice the way my hands shook as I wiped the counter and nodded. After that, I stopped offering to help with grocery lists. I stopped making the bed in the guest room each morning because it didn't feel like my bed anymore. I stopped asking if anyone needed me to pick up anything from the store. I moved through the house like someone afraid to leave footprints, careful not to disturb the rhythm of a family that no longer seemed to include me. And every night, when I lay down in the dark, I wondered how many more little cuts it would take before I bled out completely. That night, I walked into my room, and something felt wrong before I even flipped the switch. The air was heavy still, in a way that made my skin prickle. When the light didn't come on, I froze and flicked the switch again, harder this time, but nothing happened. I crossed the room and tried the lamp on the nightstand. Its cord hung loose, useless, and when I bent down to check the outlet, I saw both plugs dead. I stood there for a long moment with my hand on the wall, listening to the faint sound of laughter and silverware clinking from the kitchen. They hadn't said a word. No one came to tell me it was time to go. But sitting there in the dark, I knew this was their way of saying I didn't belong here anymore. They'd cut me off without raising their voices, without making a scene, and somehow that hurt more than if they had just thrown me out. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the shadowy corners of the room, as if the dark itself had been waiting for me. My hands rested in my lap, fingers curled in tight against my palms, and I felt my heart slow to something steady and cold. The silence pressed in on me from all sides, until I thought it might swallow me whole. But something inside me shifted as I sat there. Not out of anger, not yet, but out of clarity. If this was the message they wanted me to hear, then fine. I heard it loud and clear. I wasn't going to beg for a place in a house that had already shut me out. I wasn't going to wait around for more little humiliations until I forgot what it felt like to have dignity. I decided right then, with my feet flat on the floor and the dark closing in around me, that I would leave. But I would leave on my terms. Quietly. Stronger than they expected. The lights in this room would never come back on. But one way or another, I would find my own light again. And next time, it wouldn't be something they could ever reach to turn off. The morning after I decided to leave, I woke up with something I hadn't felt in years. Purpose. The sun had barely risen when I dressed, pulled my coat around me, and slipped out the back door while the house was still quiet. The air was sharp and clean, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was sneaking away. At the corner of Main and Fifth stood the same little bank I'd been using since Emily was a child. The woman behind the counter greeted me warmly, though I could see in her eyes she didn't really remember my name. I handed her my account number, that long string of digits I'd memorized decades ago when it still felt like a lifeline. I held my breath as she typed, half afraid the account was empty, that my memory had been playing tricks on me all these years. But then she smiled and told me the balance, and I felt my shoulders drop with quiet relief. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than enough. Enough to stand on my own 2 feet without asking for permission. I walked out of that bank feeling taller than I had in a long time. My steps quickened as I thought through what I needed to do next. There were still a few loose ends to tie up, but I already knew I was past the point of turning back. I called my lawyer later that afternoon from the library. Francine had helped me settle my husband's estate all those years ago, and she still kept an office in town. She answered on the second ring and recognized my voice immediately. I asked her to meet me in person, and she agreed without asking why. Her office was warm and smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. She sat behind her desk with her hands folded, waiting for me to speak. At first I hesitated, unsure how to explain the way my life had shrunk in that house. But she didn't need me to spell it out. She just nodded as I told her I wanted to make some quiet moves and needed her help. We went through numbers, ran the math, and I was surprised at how solid everything still looked on paper. I'd forgotten how careful I'd been over the years, how I'd managed to keep something aside, even when it felt like there was nothing left to save. Francine handed me a folder with the details and said she'd take care of the rest. Before I left her office, I stopped at the door and turned back. I told her there was one more thing. I wanted to purchase the deed to the house Emily and David were renting under my name. For the first time all morning, Francine's eyebrows rose. She gave me a small smile, almost amused, but she didn't question it. She just opened a new file and got to work. The process took a few days, but each step made me feel steadier, more alive. I kept my voice calm when I spoke to agents' signed papers with a steady hand, and never once second-guessed myself. I made sure everything was quiet and private, no letters sent to the house, no calls that Emily might overhear. On the day the papers went through, I sat in Francine's office and ran my thumb along the edge of the deed. The words printed on it felt heavier than I expected, but not in a bad way. I tucked it into my purse and thanked her before heading out into the crisp afternoon air. Walking back home that day, I felt something settle in my chest that had been missing for years. Power. Not the kind that shouts or throws weight around, but the quiet kind that comes from knowing you've taken back control of your own story. When I walked through the front door, no one looked up from their dinner. Emily barely glanced in my direction as I hung up my coat and stepped into my room. But I didn't mind. Not anymore. I sat on the edge of the bed, pulled the deed from my purse, and placed it in the drawer of the nightstand next to me. For the first time in months, I smiled. It was small and quiet, but it was real. I knew they'd find out soon enough. I knew the look on Emily's face when she learned I held the keys to her future would be worth every sleepless night I'd spent wondering how much longer I could stay invisible. That night, I lay down in the dark with a calm I couldn't quite explain. The lamp beside me still didn't turn on, but it didn't matter. I didn't need their light anymore. I was already finding my own. I woke up before the sun that morning. The house was still and quiet, the kind of quiet I used to find comforting, but now only reminded me how much space I took up in their lives. I moved through my room slowly, folding my sweaters, wrapping my few keepsakes in towels, and placing them into 2 neat boxes by the door. Every sound I made seemed louder than usual, like the house already knew what I was doing. I stopped once or twice, half expecting Emily to come knocking, but no one stirred. I taped the boxes shut and left a single envelope on the kitchen counter, written in my careful hand. It simply said, "Thank you for everything. Take care of yourselves. Nothing more." The cab I'd called the night before pulled up right on time. I carried my own bags to the curb, feeling the early chill on my cheeks as I closed the door behind me. I didn't look back. The driver helped me load the boxes, though I could have managed them myself. As we pulled away from the house, I kept my eyes straight ahead, letting the familiar streets blur into something new. There was no sadness in me anymore. Only relief. When we arrived at the apartment building, the manager was waiting with a kind smile and the keys in her hand. She led me up to the second floor, chatting softly as she opened the door. The place was bright and clean, the windows wide, and the air already felt warmer than anything I'd left behind. I stood there for a moment, just inside the threshold, taking it all in. Then I set my bags down and exhaled a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. The boxes were still stacked in the corner when my phone rang. I recognized Emily's number and let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was high and tight, frantic, demanding to know where I was and what was going on. I waited for her to stop speaking before I answered. My tone was calm even. I told her I was fine, that I'd moved into my own place, and she didn't need to worry about me anymore. She sputtered something about how I should have told her how I shouldn't have just disappeared like that. I cut her off gently. I said I finally found a place where my lights stay on. There was nothing else to say after that. I hung up and set the phone down on the little table by the window. Then I sat in the single chair the manager had left for me and watched the afternoon light spill across the floor. For the first time in a long time, I felt like myself again. And that was enough. It took just over a week for Emily to call again. This time, her voice wasn't frantic. It was clipped and cold, laced with a kind of indignation I'd grown used to over the years. She asked me to meet them at a diner near the old house, said it was important. I said yes without hesitation. I arrived a few minutes early and chose a booth by the window. The waitress brought me a cup of coffee, and I sipped it slowly while I waited. The air outside was brisk, and I could see my breath cloud against the glass when I exhaled. They showed up together, Emily clutching her purse like it held her whole life, and David walking behind her, his jaw tight. Neither of them smiled when they slid into the booth across from me. Emily's fingers tapped the table as though keeping time with her irritation. She launched straight into it, asking how I could do this to them. How I could watch them struggle and still let the rent be raised so high they'd never manage to keep up. David just sat there staring at me, his lips pressed in a hard line. I didn't answer right away. I stirred my coffee and let the silence stretch the way I used to when she was a little girl throwing a tantrum. When I finally looked up at her, my voice was calm. I told them the truth, that I had bought the house weeks ago, that the rent notice hadn't come from some stranger. It had come from me. Emily blinked, her face pale. David shifted in his seat and muttered something under his breath that I didn't bother to catch. Emily asked me why. I took a slow breath and leaned back in my seat. I told her I wanted them to know what it feels like to have your home turn cold, to live under someone else's roof and feel unwanted, to feel like every little thing you do is wrong, and that no matter how hard you try, you'll never really belong. Her mouth opened like she might argue, but I held her gaze until she looked down. David finally spoke up, his voice sharp, asking if I intended to evict them. I shook my head. Not if they could pay what it was worth. Not if they could finally show what it means to stand on their own. But I wasn't going to keep carrying them. Not anymore. I told them they had a choice. Stay and pay or find someplace else. Either way, I'd be just fine. The silence that followed was thick, heavy enough to drown in. Emily's hands trembled on the table as she stared at her lap. David stared out the window like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. I finished my coffee and set the cup down gently. Then I stood smoothing my coat and looking at each of them in turn. I told them this was never about money. It was about respect. Something they'd forgotten long before the lights went out in my room. And then I left them sitting there small and quiet for once, with nothing left to say. Outside, the air felt brighter somehow. I walked to the corner and let the wind lift my hair off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I felt like the ground beneath me was mine again. Justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. And that whisper was enough to carry me all the way home. The first morning in my new place, I woke to sunlight spilling through the curtains. It was quiet, except for the faint hum of the radiator and the soft chirp of birds outside my window. I sat up slowly, letting the warmth settle over me, like a promise that things would be different here. Unpacking took a few days, but I didn't rush. Each box I opened felt like another little piece of myself returning to me. I lined my books on the shelf, folded my quilts neatly in the closet, and placed my husband's photograph on the windowsill, where the light caught his smile just right. In the afternoons, I sat on the little porch with a cup of tea and watched my neighbors come and go. One of them, a kind woman named Rita, stopped by with a small pot of lavender as a housewarming gift. We sat and talked for an hour that day, her easy laugh filling the air as she welcomed me to the building. On weekends, I started tending to a small strip of soil just beneath my window. I planted the lavender Rita had brought me along with rosemary and a few bright marigolds. Each morning, I'd water them and breathe in the scent of fresh earth and possibility. I also visited Francine, again my lawyer, to make a few changes. Sitting in her office, I signed the papers that rewrote my will. My money would go to a scholarship fund for women over 40 going back to school. I wanted someone else to have a chance to start over just like I had. That evening, I walked home feeling lighter than I had in years. My steps were unhurried, my thoughts quiet, and when I turned the key to my door, I finally felt what I'd been chasing all this time. Home. Inside, the lavender on the windowsill caught the breeze and swayed gently, filling the room with its sweet scent. I sank into my chair by the window, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and sipped tea as the sun dipped low. It wasn't a grand life, but it was mine, and that was enough. If you're still listening, there's something I need you to hear. You are never too old or too small to take your life back. No matter how long you've been quiet, no matter how much you've given away, there is still a piece of you worth protecting. It took me far too long to understand that staying in a place where you are only tolerated slowly erases you. I told myself for years that I was lucky just to have a roof, but I see now that peace is worth more than anything. It's not selfish to choose yourself. You don't have to wait for permission. You don't have to wait for someone to see your value. You can pack your things and go even if your hands shake as you lock the door behind you. If you feel invisible, if you feel like your no doesn't matter, I want you to know it does. It matters because you matter. You are allowed to take up space in this world and to find someplace that feels like yours. I thought I was too late, but sitting here tonight with my window open and the air smelling faintly of lavender, I know now that it's never too late. You deserve quiet that doesn't hurt. You deserve light that no one can turn off. You deserve to feel at home in your own life. So if you've been waiting for a sign, let this be it. Stand up, take back your name, and don't let anyone make you feel like you're too much or not enough ever again.